Welcome to the 1-5 review video, everyone. Today we'll be looking at Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, norming it very quickly according to that video that you watched, the video not by me. And then we'll take those two ideas as well as other ideas from our course and apply those to Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway. So let's jump right into it. Let's just remind ourselves of a brief summary of the two eco-critical readings that we got from William Wordsworth's poem. Now, of course, other readings are possible, but I liked the video and what it outlined because it gave two very different interpretations of the poem, one of them more positive, one of them more negative, of course. So the more negative reading, I suppose we could say, and maybe we don't want to call it negative, but I think it does seem negative compared to the other anyway, is that the speaker is using nature here, right? He's using nature as a resource to construct a self, to build his imagination, to build a sense of wonder and his happiness. Now, that doesn't sound bad. It's good to have wonder and happiness. The critique of the poem is that there's nothing in it for nature. This is all human-based. It's an anthropocentric world, an anthropocentric view. Nature is of human use to make us wonder and to awe us. But, we could still devastate nature. We could devastate most of nature. And as long as there is something to awe us in some section of the environment, then everything is okay, right? So this isn't a poem that's calling for restoration or protection of the environment or conservation or something like that. Rather, it's just being used as a resource to make us feel good about ourselves. And again, that's not bad necessarily, but you could see that view put across a large swath of the world would clearly create problems, right? All right, so that's why it might be bad. You have a nice list here. It moves us away potentially from reasons of conservation, preservation. It's simply a resource for people for pure spiritual exploration, right? And it doesn't delve into ecological relationships. What do we owe nature? What's our responsibility toward nature? We don't really get that in the poem, all right? And so we could critique the poem for that. The speaker is overlooking those things. And again, that isn't bad. It's just noticing for our course what this type of nature poem, so to speak, does not do, what it does do and what it doesn't do. So here's potentially a summary of the more positive reading, the counter arguments. The poem delivers an appreciation of nature. Even if it is for changing one's mood or engaging the imagination, that's still positive. It's not destructive of nature. We don't see nature destroyed here. Clearly, this speaker loves nature. That seems good. Might lead to a more care or stewardship-based view of nature, whether it's for the person who reads this poem or if we imagine the speaker having a life outside of this poem. That would be good. And if nature and humans are interdependent, then human advance of this sort is an advance in the definition or use of nature. And as we know, the way that humans define nature define how we treat nature. So the fact that we write poems like this, even if it is just so that when we're laying on our couch, we feel good. We have the bliss of solitude, bliss when we lie on the couch. That's still good for nature because nature suffers when we define it negatively or think of it having only uses of profit. And this isn't for economic profit. It is for psychological profit or social profit or spiritual profit or something like this. And so that is still good. And so that would be a different way to read this poem. And there's plenty of evidence to support that as we go through. Now, what might that look like? Or how can we read this? If we wanted to look at the first two stanzas, we might say this. And this is getting us closer to an ecological reading, which would be a third way to read this, even though the things I'll point out would work for the first two readings as well. And this is a nice breakdown of the poem, which we haven't done yet. You might notice the first two stanzas are mainly the observation of nature, right? The second two stanzas are more for the speaker, the human, right? He's become company with this nature. It's social, which is a word that was used in the video. He's having some sort of social relationship with nature. And now actually, to some extent, he's removed from it. He's on his couch or imagining that when he's on his couch, he can just imagine the scene on his inner eye and feel the bliss of solitude, right? And his heart can still dance with the daffodils, even if he's removed from nature. He's taking it with him. So just notice the breakdown of two stanzas on nature, one on maybe the communion or social relationship with nature, and one on how you can use nature and reflect on it to have a meaningful human experience, right? So when we see that, though, what do we do with that? Okay, well, that can support our first two interpretations. If we wanted to build an ecological reading, we might say, well, the closest he gets to ecology, to seeing the interdependence of all things, is happening here. We see the golden daffodils. He sees the lake beneath the trees. But there's no commentary on the interdependence of these, the importance of these, his equality with these. There's no power struggle either, right? So we don't see that. We don't see any domination of nature. We don't see any stewardship either, right? It seems to evade both of those basic things that we learned about in the beginning of the course. We can guess that it might lead to one or the other, but that's all we can do here. So in ecological reading, we don't have much on the interdependence of nature or how these things in themselves are creating their own beauty, the interdependence being the beauty. Rather, they are just a beautiful thing to observe and have an effect on the speaker later when he's at home. So if we're going to give an ecological reading, it'd be a pretty poor one. It's hard to find a lot of ecological commentary in here. And so we're probably led back to the first two readings as ways of reading this poem. Okay. So the big takeaway then is nature social in some way, right? Or are we using nature for our own selfish purposes? Those are the two things we can now pull forward when we answer the question of what Nick is doing in nature in Big Two-Hearted River. So for your post, I asked you to answer two basic questions, and there's lots of evidence to back these up, and we do want you to have evidence, specific sections of the story that you feel support your answers to these questions. Why does the title imply the river has two hearts, and what are those two hearts? What are the two things the river can be for Nick, or that the story is telling us, the reader, the river can be, if it can be these two different things? What are those two things in your estimation, and how do you support that the river can be two different things? Are they opposites, or they don't have to be opposites, good versus bad? Oftentimes life is more subtle than that. Nothing is totally good, nothing is totally bad, but just that the river offers Nick two different things on the philosophical or spiritual, psychological level, something like this. And then one way to think about this, of course, is to use the two critical methods that we just went over from Lonely as a Cloud, that there's something social or spiritual in nature. And then the other one, that that we have a little bit darker use of nature and we're using it for our own purposes in some way. Okay. So, to construct a new self, basically we could say there. And so those are clearly Nick is constructing a new self. Remember the background, we know who Nick is. I told you a bit in the preview video. He likely is suffering from what we would call in the modern day PTSD, shell shock, from serving in World War I. He's returned home, and he's clearly returning to places he's been because he's trying to reconstruct a self. He's not sure what to think of life. And so that gets us into the basic setting, and the setting is always part of the argument, part of the interpretation, right? So you might look at this and say the setting is a return for Nick, but everything is different. The physical difference of the town and the setting, remember it's burnt up, and the town is different as well. He remembers how the town was different, but mainly it's everything being burnt that is the major setting, at least in part one. The physical difference of the town mirrors his inner psyche, right? Nothing is the same after the war. Modern civilization sent him away to war in Europe, and modern civilization here has disappeared. This town has become a ghost town. The environment has been burnt up. We don't know if humans actually burnt the environment or if it was a lightning strike. So that's really interesting, in that the devastation here, the terrain that's devastated, we don't know if it's nature or humans that did it. We're left to kind of guess at what that might be. But we still have to deal with the setting being one that is not ideal and is different than the past. So it seems that Nick has lost something in some way, right? So the setting also captures a fairly bleak and slow pace of the story. Remember, Nick is searching, especially in part one. There's not a lot of action or activity in the surroundings. And so we could say, is the closed up town a commentary on human civilization's failings? As I mentioned, is this a connection to World War I, the modern era, our technology, our progress, if we want to tie it back to the fallen progress narratives, have somehow fallen short. All the technology, all the potential of the early 20th century industrial complex all led to World War I and all those guns and bombs that killed more people quicker than we had ever killed people in human history, right? People by the tens of thousands in a day sometimes in World War I, right? And so this could be a commentary. The story was written in 1925 on this. And so Nick is dealing with human civilization's failings, and he returns to nature to do so. So we're cast back to, in many ways, the fall and recovery narrative, right? All right, so are we supposed to see the closed down town, which is bleak and unhealing, as the opposite of the river, or the same as the river? One really interesting thing is that the ecology is recovering. He sees the grasshoppers, they've changed, right? But the river itself is still functional. He's in there fishing and catching the big fish. And so we don't know if we're supposed to see the town as opposite of the river in nature or not. Again, that would be open to your interpretation of the story. If the town being burnt up matters, or if it's sort of a new beginning, right? Out of the fire comes the new town, the new nature and recovery. You could read it that way as well. So therefore, burning everything down is actually a good ecological start, and the river is still ecologically functional. So you could read it that way. All right, so we have some early foreshadowing of the town and the river, and what you make of that is up to you. Worth mentioning, I know you can see them on the screen, but is the closed down town meant to set up the contrast that the river is healing, right? That it is nature and it is healing, and that the town is not. Those are other considerations and interpretations. Let's now talk about Nick as character. We normally get a character's thoughts. Notice that Nick doesn't have a lot of emotion, doesn't have a lot of reflection. If we look at the first two paragraphs, we see only observation. There's not a lot of reaction or response. This is partly because of his PTSD, and he's searching. He doesn't know how to feel about these things. And part of the literary experiment is just to show somebody who doesn't think like a normal person, right? And this is Hemingway's commentary on what the war could do to the inner psyche of people. If we look at it's all observation. If we just read the first two paragraphs, they're a great start. Story's always open with making a major theme known in some way, and the style is doing it here. Nick sat down. He does note that there used to be 13 saloons and now they're not there. He just sees chipped stone, things are split, the surface is burned. He's looking at the hillsides. The river was there, right? Maybe he was worried it wouldn't be or something like this, but so that hasn't changed at least. So we see the river enter as a force in this story. He's just looking down into the water. He doesn't have any feelings about it. Does it look good? Does it look bad? What's exciting about it? He's not looking forward to anything. All the things we would normally expect to hear of that we would do in our own mind and that most characters would have added in are totally and completely missing. The first thing we really see is on page 178. In paragraph 2, he finally says, they were very satisfactory, and he was happy. Notice we don't even get first person here. It's told in third person. So the narrator, that distant voice, is telling us how Nick feels. That makes us seem even more distant from Nick. And so that's part of what's going on in this story too. That's part of the story's tropes. But we do finally get a little bit of commentary. Notice he's never overjoyed, and it's very, very simple words: satisfactory, happy. That seems to be the extent of his emotions. It'd be the only emotions he's capable of. If we want to turn now to page 179, we can start to find some evidence of that deals with nature and Nick's attitude toward nature a bit more. Maybe nature is hope or healing. Nature is eternal, always existing, at least in the human mind. So this is back to, is Nick using nature for his own purposes, right? And so we're getting some commentary on the way that we use nature as a symbol or use it even physically, but for our own purposes. And on page 179, Nick says, the country was burned over and changed, but it did not matter. It could not all be burned. So we don't know if he's literally commenting on, well, we couldn't burn down this many acres. The fire must have stopped somewhere. I'll find the good nature. Or is this commentary on what nature means to the human mind, regardless of it literally being gone and all burned up? It could never be burned because he's working from his memories. He's working from his spiritual needs for nature. So in that way, nature can never be fully consumed. It's always there with us. The fact that you're out there in it, or that you're imagining it, much as in Wordsworth's poem, is all that you need, right? So that can be beautiful, but also dangerous because it can make us mistreat nature, or not seek communion in nature. How you interpret that line is completely up to you, but that is an important line, and those are the type of lines that we want to note because it is signaling something about the human uses of nature, as